Hi, this is Mary Neal Metter. I'm a consultant at Writing Across the Curriculum and the University Writing Center. I'm going to be talking today about how reflection actually works. But first, we do not learn from experience, we learn from reflecting on experience. John Dewey is, of course, our best known proponent for progressive education. This statement sums up his view on learning from his years of doing, thinking, and writing about it. But he could not have known about the scientific methods used today to back up his insight with hard evidence. And our second quote, insight into our own thoughts or metacognition is key to high achievement in all domains. Stephen Fleming is not as well known as Dewey, but he is one of the researchers whose work I found particularly interesting. He is a fellow at the Department of Experimental Psychology at the University of London and principal investigator at the Wellcome Center for Human Neuroimaging, where he leads the metacognition group. He is the author of a recently published popular science book, Know Thyself: The New Science of Self-Awareness. What is the link between reflection and learning? There are a couple of ways of getting to an answer, but let's start with some basics. First, the human brain. All the parts here that are in pretty colors are part of the cerebrum. If it were in real color, it would be sort of pinkish gray. That gray matter, the outermost layer of the human brain, is only an average of 3 millimeters thick. This outer layer of neurons is the cerebral cortex. We humans are not unique in having a cerebral cortex. Other mammals and even non-avian reptiles have one too, but ours is disproportionately large and complex compared to the others. It is so expanded in humans that it has to be folded in on itself to fit inside the skull. One study that compared human brains to chimpanzee brains found that genes are far less responsible for the organization of the cerebral cortex in humans. Our brains are much more flexible than those of other primates, whose genes regulate how their brains are structured. Our brains organize themselves in response to many kinds of stimuli. If you're interested in the degree of variability of brain organization in individuals, check out the Gordon et al. Article in the bibliography at the end of this presentation. So, we have a cerebral cortex, and it's special. Well, what does it do? The cerebral cortex enables the phenomenon we call consciousness. It is responsible for higher cognition, and because of its plasticity, it gives us humans a much greater ability to adapt and learn. One section of the cerebral cortex is the prefrontal cortex, which is generally responsible for planning and abstract thought. If we move from neuroanatomy to the realm of psychology and think in terms of brain processes, another difference in the human brain takes us from cognition, or thought processes, which animals have too, to metacognition, thinking about our thought processes. One of the processes of metacognition is reflection. But what are the implications for writing pedagogy? There are several ways to get at this. We're going to look at a few paths that lead us to some paradigmatic concepts that are important in the neuropsychology of learning. First, some definitions and key concepts. What is executive functioning, or EF? The definition is, it is the conscious, top-down, attentional control of thought, action, and emotion. For college students, some important EF capabilities include reading a syllabus and retaining information from it, paying attention to assignments and due dates for several different courses, scheduling and organizing work without intervention, and working on bigger long-term projects. These all require developed EF skills. Our second one is metacognition. Cognitive functions are processes in the brain. Metacognition involves conscious awareness of and reflection on these cognitive processes. Here's an example of the difference between a cognitive process and a metacognitive process. We've all had the experience of not being able to recall a particular word, even when you know that retrieval is possible. In neuropsychology, this is called a tip-of-the-tongue experience, or a TOT. You may know what the word means, how many syllables it has, or even what letter it starts with, but you can't recall the word itself. The cognitive part of this experience is word retrieval, but this cognitive process is not working right. The metacognitive experience of a TOT is your consciousness of your inability to recall the word, the inner commentary on what's happening. The metacognition is like the check engine light. It's not the problem, but it alerts us to the problem. This is a uniquely human capacity that gives us the ability to do something about a problem. We are aware of the nature of it, and we can try different strategies to recall that word. Of course, one strategy is to stop thinking about it. And fMRI. Functional neuroimaging techniques, including functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI, measure aspects of brain function such as glucose or oxygen metabolism, blood flow, electrical activity, neurotransmitter activity, or tissue concentrations of specific chemicals. These techniques can reveal both structural and functional information. In other words, looking in real time at what parts of the brain are activated and how much activity there is during different kinds of cognitive and metacognitive processes. So, executive functioning, or EF, and metacognition are two key concepts we will be talking about. fMRI is one way scientists are learning about the physiological basis of these processes. Okay, executive functioning. As Stephen Fleming has pointed out, one of the foundations of successful academic achievement is executive functioning. EF skills emerge in infancy and typically become more effective and efficient throughout childhood and adolescence and into early adulthood. EF skills can be cultivated through scaffolded training. This is something that neuropsychologists are now studying through brain imaging methods such as fMRI. So, executive functioning, or EF, is going to be our path one into learning about reflection and learning. I have a quick comment to make that came up while I was doing this research. When young people experience trauma or stress, the emergence of EF skills is disrupted because their neural development is disrupted. So let's watch for that in our students for the next couple of years. They are at an age when their EF skills are still developing, and because of the pandemic, these skills may not be where we might reasonably expect them to be at 18 or even in their early 20s. So let's be aware and patient until they can catch up. One influential model of EF suggests that there are three different cognitive processes operating to produce these skills. Working memory, which is the ability to hold, manipulate, and update information in the mind. Inhibition, which is the ability to tune out distractions and focus on a task. And task shifting, mental flexibility, the ability to switch tasks, which is not simple in academic environments. It involves shifting to a different mental schema or paradigm needed for a new intellectual task. Imagine having a 10 o'clock class in Spanish and an 11 o'clock class in chemistry. You're really going to have to switch gears. There are neural systems that support these skills. The development of EF skills is interwoven with brain development. From the prenatal period through adolescence, brain development occurs cyclically, with areas of the brain that are associated with more basic processes, such as sensory motor skills, developing first, and higher order areas associated with more complex processes, such as cognitive skills, developing later. These complex processes then regulate the basic processes while also being influenced by them in a self-reinforcing cycle that depends on the plasticity of the human brain. During adolescence, the neurons in gray matter are pruned and refined as white matter, which unites different regions into networks, expands. Each individual's pattern of how this happens is unique and depends on their own experiences. The brain doesn't stabilize until the mid-20s, when the connecting strands in the white matter are covered with insulation called myelin. Several studies of adolescent decision-making suggest that at this age there is a discrepancy between a relatively mature bottom-up sensory motor system and a relatively underdeveloped top-down cognitive and emotional system. This is why when teenagers have all the information and tools they need to accomplish a task, they sometimes just don't do it. This introduces us to the concept where there are two domains where EF skills operate: hot, where emotions are involved, and cool, where emotions are not really a concern. One experiment I read about demonstrated the difference in EF under hot and cool conditions. This is a variation of the famous marshmallow test, where a child is given a choice of one marshmallow right now versus 2 or 3 marshmallows if they can wait a few minutes. In this variation, a preschool child is asked to make this choice for another person. Even little kids can see the obvious advantage to delaying gratification, and they will choose for the other person to wait and get 3. But then, when they are asked to make the same choice for themselves, they take the single marshmallow up front even after the other person got 3. The difference is there was no emotion involved in the cognition of making the choice for the other person. In higher education, we're mostly going to be looking at the cool side, but it's not like they're clearly divided. Especially with adolescents and young adults, there's pretty much always some emotion involved. So think about how their emotions might be supporting or blowing up their EF skills. So our second path is going to look at experiential learning cycles. There are several different formulations involving up to 6 steps in the cycle, but at the foundation of all of them, there is an essential theory of how people learn through experience. We'll just look at the basic paradigm of this to see how reflection functions in these cycles. Here's a note on vocabulary. Most uses of the term experiential learning have to do with experience-based training and education programs, or things like service learning. But here, the phrase is going to be applied to a more general understanding of how human beings learn most effectively. The theory of experiential learning cycles proposes a recursive set of processes that underlie learning. So, Confucius had an opinion, which was that learning involved only experience. Tell me and I'll forget, show me and I may remember, involve me and I will understand. So, learning by doing. One of the first time reflection comes up in the discussion of learning is from the Outward Bound program in the 1970s, which posited a 2-stage process of experience and reflection. Although not every Manly Trip leader in the 1970s was on board with reflection. Some of these guys, among them college classmates of mine in Vermont, were all about doing and not so much about the talking. Next comes 2 different 3-stage models, one from Dewey himself, observation, recollection, judgment, and a more contemporary version, do, review, plan. What this adds to the 2 stages of experience and reflection is the idea that reflection can be used to extrapolate and project how the new information might contribute to future challenges. Kolb's 4-stage model is the best known in the field of education: concrete experiencing, reflecting, abstracting, and acting. This formulation divides reflecting into observation and abstraction and adds the mandate to act, to try new things out in different situations, rather than just knowing the learned information is available in case it's needed. There are several 5-stage models and even a 6-stage model that I'm not going to go into because they don't make sense without a lot of explanation. Kolb and Kolb note: the most important aspect of the learning cycle is that it describes the learning process as a recursive circle or spiral, as opposed to the linear, traditional information transmission model of learning used in most education, where information is transferred from the teacher to the learner to be stored in declarative memory for later recall. What they mean by this, in other words, reflection nukes the banking model of education. Our third path is going to be looking at the results of a set of traditional mixed method psychological evaluations to test 3 hypotheses about the value and influence of reflection in learning. Writing about organizational learning in a publication for the Harvard Business School, 4 researchers designed 3 experiments to test which was more effective: gaining more experience at a task or reflecting on learning the task. One field experiment randomly assigned new hires in a tech support call center in India to either a reflection or additional experience condition while learning their new job. This was followed up with 2 laboratory experiments with participants recruited through Amazon's Mechanical Turk. In the first experiment, individuals were given 15 minutes at the end of the workday to either reflect on their experience or use the 15 minutes to continue doing the task to gain more experience. Those who were assigned to reflect improved their performance on a final assessment by 23.2% over those who were given the same amount of time to accumulate additional experience. In a second laboratory-based experiment, investigators looked at 2 different mechanisms, one cognitive, one emotional. Participants were asked to perform a task that involved counting the number of tumor cells that appeared within an image. After being shown what to look for and a practice round, they performed the first round of 5 images. Then they were assigned to one of 3 conditions: reflection, practice, or control. Those in the reflection group were given 3 minutes to write down the main lessons they had learned. In the practice group, they looked at more images. In the control group, they were asked to read an unrelated story for 3 minutes and told they would be asked a few questions about it at a later time. Before moving on to the second round, all participants filled out a questionnaire that probed both how well they understood the task, the cognitive mechanism, and their own sense of how confident they felt in their work, an emotional mechanism called self-efficacy. After the second round of looking for tumor cells, their accuracy was scored. All the groups improved, but those in the reflection group showed more improvement in their accuracy of counted tumor cells. Scores did not differ for participants in the practice group compared to those in the control group, which was a surprise because you would have thought that a little more experience would have been better than reading a story, but it wasn't. All the group scores for self-efficacy improved. Those in the reflection group improved most. The practice group scored lower than the reflection group, but higher than the control group. Those in the reflection condition also scored higher on task understanding. Scores of those in the practice group and the control group were also improved, but did not differ from each other. A regression analysis showed that task understanding was more influential than self-efficacy in improving accuracy. In the third experiment, investigators wanted to look at people's beliefs about the benefit of reflection versus practice to see whether the superiority of reflection is contrary to most people's intuition about learning. The task was to solve mathematical brain teasers to find which 2 of the squares add up to 10 and to do this in less than 20 seconds. Participants earned $1 every time they were successful. I would have walked away with no money. After a practice round and a first round of 5 puzzles, they were given a choice between structured reflection through articulating and codifying their experience or practicing to gain more experience. 82% of them chose to have more experience, and only 18% chose reflection. They then completed 2 more rounds of 5 puzzles. Results were consistent with the previous experiments. Those who chose reflection performed about 22% better than those who chose experience. The 18% were right. In their discussion section, the authors noted, "In our daily battle against the clock, taking time to step back and engage in a deliberate effort to learn from one's prior experience would seem to be a luxurious pursuit. Articulating and codifying prior experience does entail the high opportunity cost of one's time, yet we argue and show that thinking after completing tasks is no idle pursuit. It can powerfully enhance the learning process, and it does so more than the accumulation of additional experience in the same task." So here we are, practice or reflection. Let's start with students learning how to do a new thing, write a college-level research paper. Let's assume the topic is something they don't know much about. You've given them some scaffolded assignments, such as finding credible sources, creating an annotated bibliography, and writing a first draft that includes a thesis. They hand their drafts in. You read the drafts. You see immediately that for many of them, the research is pretty shallow and that they really haven't come up with a thesis. There's a kind of emerging point of view that leads in a direction, but there's not really any support for it. What's your next move? You could assign them the task of finding more sources to strengthen or create a real thesis. You think if they get the opportunity to go back and do some more work, they'll build on what they've already done to find better, more targeted sources and keep better notes. Surely they learned that the way they did it the first time was not quite good enough, right? This is an assignment to gain more experience at the task. But what if you asked the students at the next class meeting to open up a new document and write what they think they could have done better during that process? Make it clear that you're not going to read it, but see if anyone will share one thing they wrote. Encourage more sharing from other students. This is a brief, low-stakes, written reflection on their own performance. Given the crazed pace of work in our society, we will always wonder if it's worth giving up part of a class period to do this. You could have used the valuable class time to move forward with the subject material and simply assign the students to gain more experience outside of class meetings. However, the studies we've looked at, and others, have shown that there is more benefit to reflection on the learning process than there is in getting more experience. Low-stakes assignments take the emotion out, leaving executive functioning in cool mode. With the emotion disempowered, students can proceed to dip into some metacognition and think about what they're thinking about. Self-efficacy, a student's confidence that they can complete a task, is a major construct in the field of college student development. Self-efficacy doesn't appear on its own. It is built by having positive learning experiences. The higher a student's sense of self-efficacy, the more they can approach a new task with the feeling that they can do it. And successfully completing tasks builds more self-efficacy. Our conclusion is then that learning gained through reflection supports executive functioning skills and sense of self-efficacy, enables the generation of new solutions to problems students are experiencing, and establishes a stronger experiential learning cycle. So finally, we have a little bit of time for questions, and I'll come back in real life with you. But before we do that, let's take 2 minutes so y'all can jot down the 2 most important takeaways you want to remember from this presentation. Okay, thanks. Does anyone have a takeaway they'd like to share or a question they'd like to ask? I'll say thank you in advance now and come back to real life with you. Thanks.